My stepmother makes me work a lot. A little girl goes to the police station and says. The memory was hazy, like a faded photograph, but Lucy clung to it with all her might. She was sitting on a swing, her tiny legs pumping furiously, her laughter echoing through the air. A woman with kind eyes and a warm smile was pushing her, her hands gentle but strong. Higher, Mommy, higher, Lucy giggled, her voice filled with delight. The woman smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. Hold on tight, my little sunshine, she said, her voice soft and melodious. The sun was warm on Lucy's face, the air was filled with the scent of freshly cut grass, and the world was a place of boundless joy. She felt safe, loved, cherished. She felt like she could fly. This memory, this glimpse of sunshine, was all Lucy had left of her mother. Her mother, who had died when Lucy was just 3 years old, a victim of a sudden illness that had swept through their lives like a cruel and unexpected storm. Lucy, now 5, couldn't remember all the details, but she remembered the feeling, the essence of her mother's love. It was a warmth that enveloped her, a security that protected her, a joy that filled her heart. She often retreated into this memory, especially when the darkness of her present life became too overwhelming. It was her refuge, her escape, her reminder that somewhere, sometime, she had been happy. She would close her eyes, imagine her mother's face, hear her voice, feel her touch. And for a brief moment, the pain, the loneliness, the fear would fade away, replaced by a fleeting sense of peace. But the memory was always too short, too fragile. It would inevitably crumble, shattered by the harsh reality of her present. And Lucy would be left once again in the shadows, longing for a sunshine she could no longer reach. The memory, though precious, was also a constant reminder of what she had lost, of the gaping hole in her life that could never be filled. It was a bittersweet comfort, a fragile shield against the harshness of her world. The arrival of Ellen, Lucy's stepmother, had cast a long, dark shadow over Lucy's life. It had happened quickly, a whirlwind of events that Lucy, at her young age, couldn't fully comprehend. Her father, Robert, a kind but often distant man, had met Ellen at a business conference, just a year after Lucy's mother had passed away. He had been drawn to her beauty, her charm, her apparent sophistication. He had been lonely, grieving, and desperate for companionship. Ellen, a woman with sharp features and cold, calculating eyes, had seemed eager to step into the role of wife and mother. She had promised Robert that she would love Lucy as her own, that she would create a happy and stable home for them. But the promises had been empty, the charm a facade. As soon as the wedding vows were exchanged, Ellen's true nature had emerged. She was cold, demanding, and resentful of Lucy's presence. She saw Lucy not as a child in need of love and care, but as an obstacle, a burden, a reminder of Robert's previous life. She treated her with a detached indifference, bordering on disdain. The house, once filled with the faint echoes of Lucy's mother's laughter, became a place of silence and tension. Ellen ruled the household with an iron fist, her rules strict, her expectations unreasonable. Lucy was forbidden from making noise, from playing freely, from expressing any emotion that might disrupt Ellen's carefully ordered world. She was expected to be seen and not heard, to be obedient and subservient, to be invisible. Ellen's words were sharp and critical, constantly finding fault with Lucy's behavior, her appearance, her very existence. She would criticize her for being too slow, too clumsy, too messy, too everything. "Can't you do anything right?" she would snap, her voice laced with contempt. "You're just like your mother, useless and weak." These words, spoken with such venom, cut Lucy to the core. They chipped away at her self-esteem, eroded her confidence, and reinforced her feelings of worthlessness. The contrast between Ellen and her mother was stark and painful. Her mother had been warm, loving, and patient. Ellen was cold, distant, and cruel. Her mother had filled their home with laughter and joy. Ellen filled it with silence and fear. Lucy longed for her mother's touch, for her gentle voice, for the security of her embrace. But all she had was Ellen, the stepmother who seemed to resent her very existence. The shadow of Ellen's presence loomed large, darkening every corner of Lucy's life, extinguishing the last embers of the sunshine she had once known. Lucy's days were a relentless cycle of chores, a never-ending series of tasks dictated by Ellen. She woke before dawn, her small body shivering in the cold, unheated room that had once been a storage closet. Her first task was to prepare breakfast for Ellen and her father. She had to stand on a stool to reach the stove, her small hands struggling to manage the heavy pots and pans. She had to be careful, precise, and silent. Any mistake, any spilled food, any clatter of dishes would incur Ellen's wrath. After breakfast, she had to clean the kitchen, scrubbing the counters, washing the dishes, and mopping the floor. She had to do it perfectly, leaving no streaks, no crumbs, no trace of imperfection. Then, there was laundry, dusting, vacuuming, and a myriad of other tasks that seemed far beyond the capabilities of a 5-year-old. Ellen would inspect her work with a critical eye, finding fault with even the smallest detail. "This floor is still dirty," she would say, pointing to an imaginary speck of dust. "Do it again." "These clothes aren't folded properly," she would complain, throwing the neatly stacked laundry onto the floor. "Do it again." Lucy would redo the chores, her small hands aching, her body exhausted, her spirit crushed. But it was never good enough. Ellen's criticism was relentless, her demands insatiable. She was given little time to rest, little time to play, little time to be a child. Her days were a blur of work, of exhaustion, of fear. She moved through the house like a ghost, trying to be invisible, trying to avoid attracting Ellen's attention. Her father, Robert, was often away on business trips, leaving Lucy alone with Ellen for days at a time. When he was home, he seemed oblivious to the mistreatment, blinded by Ellen's carefully constructed facade of normalcy. He would occasionally ask Lucy how she was doing, but she was too afraid to tell him the truth. She feared Ellen's retribution, and she didn't want to upset her father. So she would force a smile, say she was fine, and retreat back into her shell. She was trapped, isolated, and alone, her days a monotonous cycle of drudgery and fear. The light of her childhood had been extinguished, replaced by the oppressive darkness of Ellen's control. Dawn to dusk, her life was a testament to the cruelty that could exist within the walls of a seemingly ordinary home. Food, or the lack thereof, was another weapon in Ellen's arsenal of cruelty. Lucy was constantly hungry, her small stomach rumbling with emptiness. Ellen would serve her meager portions, barely enough to sustain a bird, let alone a growing child. She would watch Lucy eat, her eyes cold and calculating, as if begrudging her every mouthful. "Don't eat so fast," she would snap. "You'll get fat." "Don't make a mess," she would warn. "You're such a pig." Lucy would eat slowly, carefully, trying to avoid any further criticism, but the food was never enough. She would finish her plate, still feeling hungry, still craving nourishment. She would often sneak scraps of food when Ellen wasn't looking, hiding them in her pockets, saving them for later. She would drink water from the tap when Ellen wasn't around, trying to fill the emptiness in her stomach. She dreamed of food, of the delicious meals her mother used to cook, of the warm bread, the sweet fruit, the comforting stews. She dreamed of a table filled with abundance, of a plate overflowing with nourishment. But her dreams were always shattered by the harsh reality of her waking life, by the empty plate, the rumbling stomach, the constant gnawing hunger. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of chores, Lucy was served a plate of cold, leftover vegetables. She was so hungry that she ate quickly, desperate for any sustenance. Ellen, watching her with disdain, snatched the plate away before Lucy could finish. "That's enough," she said, her voice sharp. "You've had plenty. You don't need to get any fatter." Lucy stared at the empty space where her plate had been, her eyes filling with tears. She was so hungry, so weak, so desperate for a single bite of food. She retreated to her room, her small body trembling with hunger and despair. She curled up on her thin mattress, clutching her stomach, trying to ignore the gnawing pain. She closed her eyes, and again, she saw her mother's face, her warm smile, her loving eyes. She imagined her mother holding her close, feeding her delicious food, filling her with warmth and love. But the image faded, replaced by the cold, harsh reality of her empty room, her empty stomach, her empty life. The empty plate was a symbol of her deprivation, of her neglect, of the cruelty that had become her daily existence. It was a symbol of the hunger that gnawed at her, not just for food, but for love, for comfort, for a life that was rightfully hers. That night, Lucy had a dream. It was a vivid, powerful dream, filled with the warmth and love she so desperately craved. She was in a field of wild flowers, the sun shining brightly overhead. She was running, laughing, her small legs carrying her effortlessly across the soft grass. Her mother was there, her face radiant, her arms outstretched. She was wearing a white dress, and her hair was flowing in the wind. She looked like an angel. "Mommy," Lucy cried out, her voice filled with joy. Her mother knelt down, gathering Lucy into her arms. She hugged her tightly, her embrace warm and comforting. "I've missed you so much, my little sunshine," her mother whispered, her voice soft and melodious. Lucy clung to her mother, burying her face in her dress, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender and vanilla. She felt safe, loved, cherished. She felt like she had finally come home. Her mother began to sing, a lullaby that Lucy vaguely remembered from her early childhood. It was a gentle, soothing melody, filled with love and tenderness. As her mother sang, the field of wild flowers transformed into a magical garden, filled with sparkling fountains, playful animals, and trees laden with delicious fruit. Lucy ate her fill of the fruit, savoring the sweet, juicy flavors. She drank from the fountains, the water cool and refreshing. She played with the animals, laughing and giggling with pure, unadulterated joy. She felt full, happy, and content. She felt like she could stay in this dream forever, safe in her mother's arms, surrounded by beauty and love. But then, the dream began to fade. The colors became muted, the sounds became distant, the warmth began to dissipate. Lucy tried to hold on, to cling to the image of her mother, to the feeling of her embrace, but it was no use. The dream was slipping away, like sand through her fingers. "Mommy, don't go," she cried out, her voice filled with panic. Her mother smiled subtly, her eyes filled with tears. "I'll always be with you, my little sunshine," she whispered. "Always." And then, she was gone. Lucy woke up with a start, her heart pounding, her cheeks wet with tears. She was back in her cold, dark room, the harsh reality of her life crashing down on her. The dream had been so vivid, so real, that for a moment, she had believed it was true. She had believed she was with her mother again, safe and loved. But now, the emptiness returned, the loneliness, the despair. The dream had been a fleeting escape, a temporary reprieve from the harshness of her reality. She curled up on her mattress, clutching the thin blanket, trying to recapture the warmth of her mother's embrace, the sound of her voice, the feeling of being loved. But the dream was gone, replaced by the cold, hard truth of her existence. She was alone, unloved, and trapped in a nightmare that seemed to have no end. The fleeting dream, though beautiful, had only intensified her longing, her grief, her sense of loss. It was a reminder of what she had lost, of what she could never have again. The days that followed were a blur of relentless chores, constant criticism, and gnawing hunger. Lucy moved through her life like a robot, her spirit broken, her body exhausted. She had lost all hope, all sense of joy, all will to resist. She had become a shadow of her former self, a pale, thin, silent child, trapped in a world of cruelty and neglect. She no longer cried, no longer protested, no longer even dreamed of escape. She simply endured. But even in her despair, a tiny spark of resilience remained, a flicker of defiance that refused to be extinguished. It was the memory of her mother, the image of her smiling face, the sound of her gentle voice. It was the last vestige of hope, the last ember of her spirit. One afternoon, as Lucy was scrubbing the kitchen floor, Ellen entered the room, her face contorted with anger. "What is this?" she shrieked, pointing to a small, almost invisible streak on the floor. "I told you to clean this floor. Are you deaf? Are you stupid?" Lucy, her body trembling, said nothing. She knew that any response, any defense, would only make things worse. Ellen grabbed Lucy's arm, her fingers digging into her flesh. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," she yelled. She yanked Lucy to her feet, her grip so tight that Lucy cried out in pain. "You're worthless," Ellen hissed, her eyes filled with hatred. "You're nothing but a burden, a waste of space." She raised her hand, as if to strike Lucy. And in that moment, something snapped within Lucy. The fear, the despair, the hopelessness that had consumed her for so long suddenly gave way to a surge of anger, of defiance, of desperation. She couldn't take it anymore. She wouldn't take it anymore. She had to escape, to get away, to find someone, anyone, who would help her. As Ellen's hand came down, Lucy ducked, pulling away from her grasp. She ran, her small legs pumping as fast as they could, towards the front door. Ellen, surprised by Lucy's sudden resistance, lunged after her, grabbing at her clothes. But Lucy was too quick. She reached the door, fumbled with the lock, and yanked it open. She ran out into the street, not knowing where she was going, only knowing that she had to get away from Ellen, from the house, from the nightmare that had become her life. Ellen shouted after her, her voice filled with rage. "Get back here, you ungrateful brat." But Lucy didn't stop. She ran faster, her bare feet pounding on the pavement, her lungs burning, her heart racing. She ran past houses, past shops, past people who stared at her with curious eyes. She didn't care. She had to keep running, had to find a safe place, had to find someone who would help her. She ran until she could run no more, her legs giving out from under her body collapsing onto the sidewalk. She lay there, panting, exhausted, her body trembling with fear and exertion. She looked around, trying to get her bearings. She didn't recognize her surroundings. She was lost, alone, and vulnerable. But she had escaped. She had broken free from Ellen's control, from the cycle of abuse and neglect. She had taken the first step, the most difficult step, towards a new life. And as she lay there, on the cold, hard pavement, a glimmer of hope, a flicker of determination, began to rekindle within her. She would not give up. She would not be defeated. She would find a way to survive, to find a way to be happy again. The breaking point had been reached, and in that moment of desperation, Lucy had found the strength to break free, to seek a better future, to reclaim her life. The night was cold, the streets dark and unfamiliar. Lucy, her small body shivering in her thin pajamas, wandered aimlessly, her bare feet aching from the rough pavement. She had no idea where she was going, only that she had to get as far away from Ellen as possible. Tears streamed down her face, blurring her vision. She was scared, lost, and alone. But she kept walking, driven by a primal instinct to survive, to find safety, to find someone who would help her. She walked past darkened houses, their windows glowing faintly with the light of televisions and lamps. She imagined families gathered inside, warm and safe, sharing meals and laughter. She longed for that warmth, that safety, that sense of belonging. She walked past empty shops, their doors locked, their windows displaying goods she could only dream of. She thought of the food she had been denied, of the toys she had never had, of the simple comforts that other children took for granted. She walked past alleys, dark and menacing, their shadows hiding unknown dangers. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding with fear, imagining the creatures that might lurk within. As she walked, she remembered the stories her mother used to tell her, stories of brave knights, of magical creatures, of happy endings. She clung to those stories, to the hope they represented, to the belief that good could triumph over evil. She imagined herself as a brave knight, escaping from a wicked sorceress, searching for a safe haven. She imagined her mother as a guiding star, watching over her, protecting her from harm. The image of her mother gave her strength, gave her courage, gave her the will to keep going. She would not give up. She would not let Ellen win. She would find a way to escape, to find a better life. As she rounded a corner, she saw a building in the distance, its lights shining brightly in the darkness. It was a large, imposing building, with a flag flying proudly above it. She didn't know what it was, but it looked safe, it looked official, it looked like a place where she might find help. She started to run, her legs aching, her lungs burning. She ran towards the light, towards the hope, towards the possibility of salvation. As she got closer, she saw the sign above the door, Oakwood Police Department, Precinct 18. The police. She had seen them on television, in movies, in her mother's storybooks. They were supposed to be the good guys, the protectors, the ones who helped people in need. She hesitated for a moment, her fear battling with her desperation. Could she trust them? Would they believe her? Would they help her? She remembered Officer Miller and Officer Jones, the men who had arrested her mother. She remembered their cold eyes, their harsh voices, their cruelty. But she had nowhere else to go. She was exhausted, hungry, and terrified. She had to take a chance. She had to trust that somewhere, somehow, there were good people who would help her. With a deep breath, she walked towards the entrance of the police station, her small hand reaching for the heavy door. She was about to step out of the darkness and into the light, to seek refuge in the very place that had once represented fear and injustice. It was a leap of faith, a desperate gamble, a testament to the resilience of a 5-year-old child who had been forced to grow up too fast. Lucy pushed open the heavy door of the police station and stepped inside, her small body dwarfed by the imposing space. The air was warm, a stark contrast to the cold night air outside. The room was brightly lit, and she blinked, her eyes adjusting to the sudden change. At the front desk sat a large, burly police officer, his uniform crisp and clean, his expression surprisingly gentle. He looked up as Lucy entered, his eyes widening slightly in surprise. "Well, hello there, little one," he said, his voice kind and reassuring. "What are you doing here all by yourself?" Lucy hesitated, her fear returning. She looked around the room, her eyes darting nervously. There were other officers present, some in uniform, some in plain clothes. They all seemed to be staring at her, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and concern. The officer at the front desk, whose name tag read Sergeant Miller, a different, unrelated Miller, smiled at her, trying to put her at ease. "It's okay," he said. "You're safe here. Can you tell me your name?" Lucy took a deep breath, trying to gather her courage. "Lucy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Lucy," Sergeant Miller repeated, his voice soft. "That's a pretty name. I'm Sergeant Miller. What brings you to the police station, Lucy?" Lucy looked down at her bare feet, her body trembling. She didn't know how to explain, how to put into words the horrors she had endured. I ran away," she stammered. "Ran away?" Sergeant Miller asked gently. "From where?" Lucy hesitated again, then, in a small voice, she said, "From my stepmother." Sergeant Miller's expression changed, his eyes narrowing slightly. He sensed that there was more to this story than a simple case of a runaway child. He knelt down, bringing himself to Lucy's level. "Why did you run away, Lucy?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Lucy looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. She saw kindness in his eyes, compassion in his expression. She felt a flicker of hope, a sense that she might finally be safe. She's mean to me," Lucy whispered, her voice trembling. "She makes me work all the time. She doesn't give me enough food. She yells at me. She hates me." Sergeant Miller's heart ached for the little girl. He had seen many cases of child abuse and neglect, but there was something about Lucy's vulnerability, her innocence, her quiet desperation, that touched him deeply. He reached out a hand, gently placing it on Lucy's shoulder. "It's okay, Lucy," he said. "You're safe now. We're going to help you." He turned to another officer, a young woman named Officer Ramirez, who had been observing the scene. "Officer Ramirez, please take Lucy to the break room and get her something to eat and drink, and find her a blanket. She's freezing." Officer Ramirez nodded, smiling warmly at Lucy. "Come with me, sweetie," she said. "We'll get you taken care of." Lucy, feeling a sense of relief wash over her, followed Officer Ramirez to the break room. She was given a warm blanket, a cup of hot chocolate, and a plate of cookies. She ate ravenously, her hunger overwhelming her fear. As she ate, Sergeant Miller made some phone calls. He contacted Child Protective Services, reporting the situation and requesting their immediate assistance. He also began to run a background check on Ellen and Robert, Lucy's stepmother and father. He knew that time was of the essence. He had to ensure Lucy's safety, and he had to gather as much information as possible before contacting her parents. He had a feeling that this was going to be a complicated and sensitive case, and he was determined to handle it with the utmost care and professionalism. He would protect this child, no matter the cost. Officer Ramirez sat with Lucy in the break room, offering gentle reassurance and companionship. She was a kind, compassionate woman, with a warm smile and a soothing voice. She had a natural empathy for children, and she quickly established a rapport with Lucy. "You're very brave, Lucy," Officer Ramirez said, as Lucy finished her hot chocolate. "You did the right thing coming here." Lucy looked up at her, her eyes still filled with fear, but also with a glimmer of hope. "Will you help me?" she asked, her voice small and hesitant. "Of course we will, sweetie," Officer Ramirez said, smiling reassuringly. "We're here to protect you, but we need your help, too. Can you tell me more about what happened at home?" Lucy hesitated, her body trembling slightly. It was difficult for her to talk about it, to relive the pain and the fear, but she knew she had to, if she wanted to escape Ellen's cruelty. She took a deep breath and began to tell her story. She spoke slowly, haltingly, at first, her voice barely above a whisper. But as she continued, her voice grew stronger, her words more confident. She told Officer Ramirez about the endless chores, the constant criticism, the lack of food, the coldness of her room. She told her about Ellen's harsh words, her angry outbursts, her constant threats. She told her about her father, how he was often away, how he seemed oblivious to her suffering, how he always sided with Ellen. She told her about her mother, about the happy memories she clung to, about the warmth and love she had lost. As she spoke, the tears flowed freely down her cheeks. But they were not just tears of sadness, they were also tears of relief, of release, of finally being able to share her burden with someone who cared. Officer Ramirez listened patiently, attentively, her expression filled with compassion and concern. She didn't interrupt, didn't judge, didn't pressure Lucy to speak. She simply offered a safe space, a listening ear, a comforting presence. She occasionally asked gentle questions, clarifying details, encouraging Lucy to continue. She took notes, carefully documenting everything Lucy said. She also noticed the small details: Lucy's thin frame, her pale complexion, her downcast eyes, her hesitant speech. These were all signs of long-term neglect and abuse, signs that confirmed Lucy's story. As Lucy's story unfolded, Officer Ramirez felt a growing sense of anger and outrage. She couldn't believe that a child could be treated so cruelly, so inhumanly. She was determined to do everything in her power to protect Lucy, to ensure that she never had to return to that house of horrors. When Lucy finished her story, she was exhausted, emotionally drained, but also relieved. She had finally shared her secret, her burden, her pain. She had found someone who believed her, who cared about her, who would help her. Officer Ramirez hugged Lucy gently, offering her comfort and reassurance. "You did good, Lucy," she said. "You were very brave. And I promise you, we're going to take care of you. You're safe now." Lucy clung to Officer Ramirez, her small body trembling. She felt a sense of hope, a sense of security, that she hadn't felt in a long time. She had found sanctuary, she had found protection, she had found a glimmer of light in the darkness of her life. Sergeant Miller, after completing his initial background checks and coordinating with Child Protective Services, approached Officer Ramirez and Lucy. He had a somber expression on his face. "Lucy," he said gently, "we need to contact your father. Do you know his phone number?" Lucy nodded, reciting the number from memory. It was a number she had been forbidden from calling, a number she had only ever used in her dreams. Sergeant Miller dialed the number, his hand resting reassuringly on Lucy's shoulder. The phone rang several times, and for a moment, Lucy feared that her father wouldn't answer, that he wouldn't care, that he would leave her to her fate. But then, a man's voice answered, sounding groggy and confused. "Hello, Mr. Robert Peterson," Sergeant Miller asked. "This is Sergeant Miller with the Oakwood Police Department. We have your daughter, Lucy, here with us." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line, followed by a sharp intake of breath. "Lucy," Robert repeated, his voice filled with disbelief and alarm. "What's happened? Is she all right?" "She's safe now, Mr. Peterson," Sergeant Miller said, his voice calm and reassuring. "But we need you to come down to the station. We need to talk to you about some serious concerns we have regarding Lucy's welfare." Robert's voice was filled with panic. "What concerns? What's going on? Is she hurt?" "Mr. Peterson, please calm down," Sergeant Miller said. "Lucy is safe, and she's being cared for. But we need you to come here as soon as possible. We need to discuss the situation in person." Robert agreed, his voice trembling with anxiety. He said he would be there within the hour. Sergeant Miller hung up the phone, turning to Officer Ramirez. "Stay with Lucy," he said. "Keep her comfortable. I'll be in my office." He walked away, his mind racing. He had a difficult conversation ahead of him. He had to inform a father that his daughter had been subjected to abuse and neglect, that his wife, the woman he had trusted, was the perpetrator. He knew it wouldn't be easy. He knew there would be denial, anger, disbelief. But he had to do it. He had to protect Lucy, and he had to ensure that justice was served. He entered his office, closing the door behind him. He sat down at his desk, took a deep breath, and prepared himself for the difficult task ahead. He was a police officer, a protector of the innocent, a guardian of the law, and he would not fail this child. He would not fail Lucy. Robert Peterson arrived at the police station in a state of barely controlled panic. He was a man of average height and build, with thinning hair and a worried expression. He looked disheveled, his clothes rumpled, his eyes bloodshot. He had clearly dressed in a hurry, throwing on whatever clothes he could find. Sergeant Miller greeted him in the lobby, his expression somber. "Mr. Peterson, thank you for coming," he said. "Please, come with me." He led Robert to a small, private room, away from the noise and activity of the main station. He offered him a chair and a glass of water. Robert sat down heavily, his hands trembling. "Where's Lucy?" he asked, his voice hoarse with anxiety. "Is she all right?" "She's safe, Mr. Peterson," Sergeant Miller said. "She's with Officer Ramirez. She's been through a lot, but she's physically unharmed." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Mr. Peterson, we have reason to believe that Lucy has been subjected to abuse and neglect at the hands of your wife, Ellen." Robert stared at him, his face paling. "What?" he gasped. That's impossible. Ellen would never hurt Lucy." "Mr. Peterson, Lucy came to us tonight, alone, in the middle of the night, Sergeant Miller said. She told us a very disturbing story. She described a pattern of emotional and physical abuse, of neglect, of deprivation. He recounted Lucy's story, detailing the excessive chores, the constant criticism, the lack of food, the isolation. He described Lucy's physical condition, her thin frame, her pale complexion, her hesitant speech. As Robert listened, his denial slowly crumbled, replaced by a growing horror, a sickening realization that his daughter had been suffering in silence, right under his nose. Tears welled up in his eyes, tears of guilt, of shame, of anger. He had failed his daughter. He had failed to protect her, to see the signs, to intervene. I didn't know, he stammered, his voice choked with emotion. I was away so much. I trusted Ellen. I thought. He couldn't finish the sentence. The weight of his realization, the enormity of his failure, was crushing him. Sergeant Miller placed a hand on Robert's shoulder, offering a gesture of compassion. Mr. Peterson, I understand this is difficult, he said, but we need your cooperation. We need to ensure Lucy's safety, and we need to hold those responsible accountable. Robert nodded, his resolve hardening. What do I need to do? He asked, his voice regaining some strength. First, we need you to see Lucy, Sergeant Miller said. She needs to see you, to know that you're here for her. He led Robert to the break room, where Lucy was sitting with Officer Ramirez, drawing pictures with crayons. As Robert entered the room, Lucy looked up, her eyes widening in surprise and relief. Daddy, she cried, jumping up from her chair and running towards him. Robert knelt down, catching her in his arms. He hugged her tightly, burying his face in her hair, tears streaming down his cheeks. Oh, Lucy, my sweet girl, he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Lucy clung to him, her small body trembling. She felt safe, protected, loved. She was finally with her father, the man who, despite his flaws and absences, was still her hero, her protector. Officer Ramirez discreetly left the room, giving father and daughter some privacy. Robert and Lucy sat together on the floor, talking, crying, and holding each other. Robert apologized profusely, promising Lucy that he would never leave her again, that he would protect her, that he would make things right. Lucy, her heart overflowing with love and forgiveness, simply clung to him, her small hand gripping his shirt tightly. She didn't blame him. She knew he hadn't known, and she knew, instinctively, that he would do everything in his power to protect her now. After a long time, Robert composed himself, wiping away his tears. He looked at Lucy, his eyes filled with a mixture of love, guilt, and determination. Lucy, he said, his voice firm, I promise you, you'll never have to go back to that house again. You're safe with me now, and I'll never let anyone hurt you again. Lucy smiled, a small, hesitant smile, but a smile nonetheless. It was the first genuine smile she had shown in a long time. It was a sign of hope, of healing, of a new beginning. Robert stood up, lifting Lucy into his arms. He carried her out of the break room, past the curious gazes of the other officers, towards the exit. He knew he had a long road ahead of him. He had to deal with Ellen, with the legal ramifications, with the emotional scars that Lucy carried. But he was ready. He was determined. He would do whatever it took to protect his daughter, to give her the life she deserved, a life filled with love, safety, and happiness. The reunion between father and daughter was a turning point, a moment of hope and healing in the midst of a dark and difficult situation. It was a testament to the enduring power of family, the unbreakable bond between a father and his child, and the promise of a brighter future. With Lucy safely in her father's care, and Robert's full cooperation, the investigation into Ellen's abuse and neglect proceeded swiftly. Sergeant Miller, along with officers from Child Protective Services CPS, obtained a warrant to search Robert and Ellen's home. The search of the house revealed a stark contrast between the public areas and Lucy's living space. The main living areas were meticulously clean and well decorated, reflecting Ellen's obsessive need for order and appearances. Lucy's small room, however, was bare, cold, and sparsely furnished. There were no toys, no decorations, no personal touches, only a thin mattress on the floor, a small, rickety dresser, and a single, bare light bulb. The investigators also found evidence of Lucy's forced labor. Cleaning supplies were stored in her room, and her small hands showed signs of excessive exposure to harsh chemicals. They found a detailed chore list, written in Ellen's handwriting, outlining Lucy's daily tasks, which were far beyond the capabilities of a 5-year-old. The investigators interviewed neighbors, who reported hearing Ellen's frequent yelling and Lucy's occasional cries. They also described Lucy as a quiet, withdrawn child, who was rarely seen outside and never allowed to play with other children. The medical examination of Lucy confirmed the extent of her neglect and abuse. She was underweight, malnourished, and showed signs of emotional trauma. She had several bruises and abrasions on her body, consistent with physical abuse. The evidence was overwhelming, painting a clear picture of a child living in a state of constant fear, deprivation, and mistreatment. Sergeant Miller, a seasoned officer hardened by years of dealing with difficult cases, was deeply affected by Lucy's situation. He had seen many cases of child abuse, but there was something about Lucy's vulnerability, her resilience, and her quiet courage that touched him profoundly. He was determined to ensure that Lucy received the justice she deserved, and that Ellen was held accountable for her crimes. He worked closely with the CPS social workers, ensuring that Lucy was placed in a safe and supportive environment where she could begin to heal from her trauma. He also worked tirelessly with the investigators, gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and building a strong case against Ellen. He was driven by a sense of moral outrage, a deep commitment to protecting children, and a personal connection to Lucy's case. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that Ellen had a history of manipulative and controlling behavior. She had carefully concealed her true nature from Robert, presenting herself as a loving and caring stepmother. She had isolated Lucy, preventing her from forming relationships with others, and making her completely dependent on Ellen's twisted sense of control. The investigation revealed that Ellen's motivation stemmed from a deep-seated resentment towards Lucy, a jealousy of her connection to Robert, and a pathological need to control and dominate those around her. She was a classic abuser, skilled at manipulation, deception, and emotional cruelty. The evidence was clear, the witnesses were credible, and the case against Ellen was strong. It was time to bring her to justice, to confront her with her crimes, and to ensure that she would never harm another child again. The confrontation with Ellen was carefully orchestrated. Sergeant Miller, accompanied by 2 other officers and a social worker from CPS, arrived at the house with an arrest warrant. Robert had taken Lucy to stay with a relative, ensuring she would not be present during the encounter. Ellen, initially surprised by the arrival of the police, quickly adopted a facade of innocence and indignation. She denied all accusations, claiming that Lucy was a difficult and disobedient child, that she had been trying her best to discipline her, and that the allegations were a complete fabrication. "This is ridiculous," she exclaimed, her voice shrill and defensive. "I'm a loving stepmother. I've done nothing wrong. This is all a misunderstanding." Sergeant Miller, unfazed by her denials, presented her with the evidence, the photos of Lucy's room, the chore list, the neighbors' statements, the medical reports, and Lucy's own testimony. As the evidence mounted, Ellen's facade began to crumble. Her denials became weaker, her voice less confident, her body language betraying her guilt. She tried to shift the blame, claiming that Lucy was a liar, that she was making up stories to get attention, that she was trying to ruin Ellen's life. But her lies were unconvincing, her attempts at manipulation futile. The evidence was too strong, too overwhelming, too damning. Sergeant Miller, his voice calm but firm, informed Ellen that she was under arrest for child abuse, neglect, and endangerment. He read her Miranda rights, his words echoing through the silent house. Ellen, her face pale, her body trembling, finally broke down. She collapsed into a chair, sobbing uncontrollably. Her carefully constructed world of lies and deceit had come crashing down around her. She was handcuffed and led away, her cries of protest echoing through the neighborhood. The neighbors, who had witnessed her cruelty for so long, watched in silence, a mixture of relief and satisfaction on their faces. The legal proceedings against Ellen were swift and decisive. She was charged with multiple counts of child abuse and neglect, and faced a lengthy prison sentence. Robert, devastated by the revelations about Ellen's true nature, fully cooperated with the authorities. He provided a detailed statement, describing his own observations and his growing suspicions about Ellen's behavior. He expressed his deep remorse for his failure to protect Lucy, and he vowed to make amends for his mistakes. He filed for divorce from Ellen, seeking full custody of Lucy. He was determined to create a safe, loving, and nurturing home for his daughter, a home where she could heal from her trauma and rebuild her life. The case against Ellen was overwhelming, and she eventually pleaded guilty to all charges, accepting a plea bargain that would send her to prison for a significant period of time. The sentencing hearing was a somber affair. Ellen, dressed in prison garb, her face devoid of makeup and her hair unkempt, stood before the judge, her eyes downcast. She offered a tearful apology, expressing remorse for her actions and begging for leniency. But the judge was unmoved. He described her crimes as heinous and unforgivable, and he sentenced her to the maximum penalty allowed by law. As Ellen was led away from the courtroom, her cries of despair echoing through the halls of justice, Lucy and Robert embraced, their tears a mixture of sadness, relief, and hope. The nightmare was over. The healing could begin. Life for Lucy and Robert changed dramatically after Ellen's imprisonment. They moved to a new house, a cozy, welcoming home filled with light, laughter, and love. Robert, determined to make up for his past mistakes, dedicated himself to being a present and attentive father. He took a leave of absence from his work, focusing all his energy on Lucy's well-being. He cooked her nutritious meals, read her bedtime stories, played games with her, and took her on outings to the park, the zoo, and the library. He enrolled her in therapy, seeking professional help to address the emotional trauma she had endured. Lucy, initially hesitant and withdrawn, slowly began to open up, to trust, to heal. She blossomed under her father's care, her spirit gradually returning, her laughter echoing through their new home. She made new friends, excelled in school, and discovered a passion for art, expressing her emotions through drawing and painting. Robert also sought therapy for himself, recognizing the need to address his own guilt and to learn how to be a better father. He learned about the signs of child abuse, about the importance of communication, about the need to be present and engaged in his child's life. He made a commitment to always listen to Lucy, to validate her feelings, to create a safe and supportive environment where she could thrive. The bond between father and daughter grew stronger with each passing day. They shared meals, conversations, and quiet moments of connection. They built a new life together, a life filled with love, trust, and mutual respect. Lucy, though she would always carry the scars of her past, began to heal. She learned to trust again, to love again, to laugh again. She discovered the joy of being a child, of being free, of being safe. She still had nightmares occasionally, waking up in the middle of the night, her heart pounding, her body trembling. But her father was always there, holding her close, comforting her, reassuring her that she was safe. As the years passed, Lucy grew into a strong, resilient, and compassionate young woman. She never forgot her past, but she didn't let it define her. She used her experience to help others, volunteering at a local shelter for abused children, sharing her story, and offering hope to those who had suffered similar traumas. She had found her voice, her strength, her purpose. She had transformed her pain into power, her suffering into service. She was a survivor, a thriver, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. And Robert, watching his daughter blossom, felt a profound sense of gratitude, of pride, of redemption. He had made mistakes, but he had learned from them. He had become the father Lucy needed, the protector she deserved, the loving parent she had always longed for. Their new beginning was a testament to the power of love, the resilience of the human spirit, and the possibility of healing even the deepest wounds. It was a story of hope, of redemption, of a father and daughter finding their way back to each other, forging a bond that would last a lifetime. The darkness had passed, and the sunshine had finally returned, brighter and more beautiful than ever before.